Hi, my name is Joe Bautista, and I'm a volunteer for the Pasadena for Rent Control and Just Cause Eviction campaign.
How did you hear about our group?
I was a part of Pasadena Tenants Union a while back, and I forget if it was 3 years ago, but then we also had tried to get rent control on the ballot, and unfortunately we had failed. And so I had continued to attend PTU meetings every now and then, and had kept in contact with a couple of people who are leading the rent control and just cause eviction campaign.
Why rent control? Why is it important to you?
There are many things in this world that one can fight for and advocate for, and unless one lives in an area where it's okay to sleep outside and have a tent, and one won't be harassed, and one's okay with living that kind of lifestyle, I mean, being able to secure one's house, one's apartment is of paramount value. And given the economics of housing, how expensive it's becoming for various reasons, various factors, I just can't think of anything that's much more important than having rent control to keep people housed.
Joe, you have kind of a fascinating background, and I think people would be very interested to know, how is it that a landlord, a former landlord now, but a landlord for a while could also be a supporter of rent control? Because in people's minds, they see so many corporate landlords as just totally focused on greed and getting extra rent every month. And so how is it that you fit into this and are still a supporter of rent control?
Oftentimes in life we have different things that we do, and whether it's to be a banker or a nurse or a parent. In my case, I was a landlord. And sometimes we lose sight of what the meaning is behind what we're asked to do. So as a landlord, what's my goal? What should have been my goal as a landlord? I sold my house just this past year. Should it have been to make as much money as I could? Is that the goal of a landlord?
That's what many people see as the province of the landlord.
That seems perverse, don't you think?
Yes, I do.
I think the province of a landlord is to help people to provide housing for people who at the moment can't afford their own house. And so, you know, as a landlord, I was called on, of course, to make repairs when people moved out, to interview people, to get them housed. But to me, you know, it wasn't about making as much money as I possibly could have. You know, I was fortunate enough to have a job at the time. I was fortunate enough to buy my house in the early 2000s. I bought a 2-unit property near USC for $165,000. I remember renting the front house for $1,500 a month. It was 3 bedrooms, and the back house, I think, for about $300 a month. And eventually the people in the back moved out. I wanted to raise their rent. I did. They didn't want to pay more, and so I asked them to leave. And then I rented it for $500 a month, the back house. And eventually I ended up raising the rent to $875, actually $850. Did a bunch of renovations, and then I raised it to $875. But all that to say, after it became $875, and the front house was always $1,500, the rents remained the same. Again, I was fortunate enough to have employment, so it wasn't my only source of income. Would I have acted differently if it was my only source of income? Maybe, maybe not. At the time, and still, the city of LA has rent control. And so even if I were, you know, wanted to raise the rent, I wouldn't be able to do it more than 2 or 3% a year. But yeah, I'm sure different people are in different situations, but I don't view landlording as an excuse to, again, to make it hard for people to live.
So tell us about this South LA Community Land Trust. What was that all about?
I'll give you a longer answer to this to explain how this developed. I was a landlord, and as a landlord, I began thinking about the power relationships between the landlord and the tenant. How does the landlord view the tenant? How does the tenant view the landlord? When the landlord comes down to say hi or to look at the house, does the tenant view the landlord with suspicion, with fear, right? And so I began to realize that when someone, in this case a landlord myself, has this much power over another, in this case the tenant, how does that affect human relationships? And so you have to begin to ask yourself the ethics and the justness of even the landlord-tenant relationship. And so I began thinking, like, is this the kind of relationships that I want to have with people indefinitely, right? A lot of people don't think of it that way, but I did, and it started to bother me. And so as a landlord, I started thinking of how to have a more just relationship, a more equitable relationship. At the end of the day, I just came to the conclusion, if the tenants don't own the house, you cannot have a just and equitable relationship. The power differential will always be too great. So I started thinking about these things, and at some point I came to a juncture where I said, okay, should I sell my house to my tenants? Is that what I should do? And then, as you know, because I had a situation before where I had a roommate, and he was a good friend. He became my good friend. He was like a mentor to me, an older brother almost. I sold it to him. I owned a condo too once. We talked earlier and you said you had owned a condo. I owned a condo on the west side. I ended up selling it to him after I had moved to Pasadena. And one day I talked to him, maybe a couple years later, and I was shocked to find out he had sold it. I had sold it to him because I knew he had gone out of prison. He was trying to make a life for himself, and I wanted him to have a house that he could stay in, till he died, I guess. I don't know. But he sold it. And so I realized at the time, or the thought came into my mind at the time, that if I sell this property to these tenants, what's going to happen afterwards? Is there going to come a point in time when that property then goes back on the speculative market? You see what I'm getting at? So let's get to the land trust that you asked me about. I've heard of this concept of a community land trust from a book that I had read written by Jill Shook about ways to keep housing affordable. And I don't know how much you know about community land trusts. I'll say a little bit for the sake of the camera and the people watching. But basically the idea is there is a nonprofit organization that holds property that it acquires and keeps it affordable in perpetuity. And so that's what I wanted to do with this property, that my tenants, once I sold it to the land trust, could still live in it and could even purchase the homes that they exist on. And this is maybe not the most glamorous way of describing it, but in a way it's a lot like a mobile home park. You can buy the structure on the mobile home park, but the land technically isn't yours. But still, it's a big step up from renting. So I talked to my tenants about the idea. I talked to the land trust. I found them on the internet. They were the closest one. And I started getting conversations going. I said, look, this is going to happen. I don't want to be your landlord anymore. I love you guys, but it's just not the life that I want to lead. We have a couple paths here. You could all buy the property, or I could sell to the land trust. So the front house people, they said, we want to buy the property. The back house people is a little bit more complicated. So to the front house people, I said, okay, let's name a price. So we did. And I kept going back and forth, back and forth. I said, look, I think I want to sell to them, but I also want to sell to you. And it was just this thing in my head, because I also didn't want the people in the front house to be under the thumb of the land trust. Because it's not, you don't completely own the house, even if you are in a land trust and you buy it. There's still things you got to follow, and it's still a little bit of, tenant or landlord-tenant to some degree. But at the end of the day, the people in the front house couldn't come up with the money soon enough. And the more that I got to know the land trust, I really started building trust in them. They wanted to include the tenants in the discussion even before we made the transaction. They wanted to talk to the tenants to find out what was going on with them. They let me be part of the process and ask them questions. They were very transparent about their finances, about their approach. And so it just seemed like a really good fit. And like I said, at the end of the day, once the tenants came up with enough money, they could buy the house that they were on. I think the thing is they would get a 99-year lease, and then they would have an option to resell, whatever the rules were, but it would be a possibility. So I built up a lot of faith in that trust, and so we eventually went into escrow. It took 4 months to close the deal, but we did it, and I was really happy with it. I still keep in touch with the land trust, and even one of my tenants who I like, I call him every now and then. I think he's a little bit angry at me, but I'll call him. I'll call him a little bit to see if that one situation that they were trying to resolve when I was their landlord is going to be resolved. And once it does, I think they'll be able to own the house, and it'll be really good for them. So things aren't always simple, but I thought that was the best out of all the options in terms of what would be good for the future.
Joe, you've mentioned that you attended Fuller Theological Seminary here in Pasadena. What effect did that have on you with landlord-tenant relationships?
I took many classes, but one class I remember taking was an ethics class. I guess I could remember his name. I think Glenn Stosson at the time had taught it. In fact, he and his family had lived just maybe 3 houses down from me here in Pasadena. Not at the time when I was taking the class, but later on. There was a book that I had read, I think, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger, written by a cider, and I actually know his niece attends the same church I attend. But it just got me thinking a lot about economics and about poverty. And I know this sounds coming like from a privileged view. It's like, well, that's great that you read a book. Like, were you actually poor? And that would be a fair critique. But all that to say is that, yeah, it got me starting to think about there are poor people, and there's really things that are really messed up about our world and about our economics and about how we get along, And so I don't know how much that was an influence, but, of course, Jesus, right? The gospel is talking about love your neighbor as yourself. And, there's a story where they call him the rich young ruler, and he approaches Jesus. He approaches Jesus, and he says, what must I do to enter the kingdom of heaven? And Jesus says, well, you know the commandments. Love your neighbor yourself. Or maybe the negative commandments. Don't commit adultery. Don't kill. Whatever. Honor your father and mother. And he says, I've done that. I've done that since I was a youth. What else can I do? And Jesus drops the bomb on him. He says, well, you can sell all that you have, give to the poor, and then when you've done that, you can come and follow me. And if you look critically at Jesus' life and his teachings, it's not about money. It's not about getting ahead. It's not about self-preservation. It's about the neighbor, about the brother, about the sister, even about the enemy. And it's about putting others before your own needs, right? To the degree that we can, to the degree that we're able, to the degree that we're mature enough to do so. And once I was able to conceptualize a life where I could forego money theoretically, and money didn't become the all-abiding impetus for what I was desiring, once I could conceive of that, then everything became clear. Then things that to me didn't make so much sense, all of a sudden made sense, like rent control, right? Like some of the other things we talked about earlier.
Well, thanks for that. That's very heartfelt. Do you have any tenant stories that are close to your heart?
Yeah, I do. When I was attending Fuller and also working there, so I was working full time and finishing up my classes. My wife and I, we decided to have sort of like a community house. We would have meals together. We'd have, first year anyway, Bible study together. We stopped that after the first year. We'd have chores that we kind of rotated. And so we invited a couple of people who attended Fuller to live with us, and we got to know them. And, like any communal experiment, it had its pluses and minuses. I certainly grew a lot in that, learned a lot about myself, my strengths as well as my weaknesses. But eventually, some of the people who went to Fuller, they moved out. And so we just put an ad out on the Craigslist saying, hey, look, we need roommates. And this is while we were renters, so we were subleasing the rooms. And we had a response from this one woman who had a daughter and a son. This woman was young. She was, I think, maybe 19, 20. So her daughter was maybe 4, maybe 5. Her son was 2. So she had kids at a really early age. And so we invited her to live with us. And we got to know her. She's a great person. And she ended up asking us later if her sister could move in with us too. So her sister came. She actually, 1 month, her old nanny came to live with us. And then her other friend came to live with us at some point. She was cool. I liked her. She was only with us for a month. But she was black. And so one twist happened in our stay that kind of turned things around for me and for her and for her whole family. At some point, our landlord had found out that we were subleasing. And it wasn't a problem for him before. I don't know why. But for some reason, this time it became a problem for him. And he asked me, he said, Joe, I heard you're subleasing. What's going on with that? Why didn't you tell us? And I said, well, I didn't think it was a big deal. I mean, we're paying our rent on time. And, I didn't know that would make you mad. I'm sorry. If you want, we can have them bring their driver's licenses and, we can show them to you. And then we can put them on the lease, no problem. And he was really upset, and I'm not exactly sure why. I suspected there might have been some racism there, I'm not sure. But within a month, I got a rent increase. I'd been there for maybe 2.5 years, and this was my first rent increase. He raised it the maximum, which is 10%. So I paid it. I'm like, okay, he's just trying to blow off steam. Okay, I can deal with another 100. That's not a problem. But then the next month came. And as you know, in Pasadena, the way things are right now, after the first rent increase, the next rent increase can be arbitrary. There is no limit to the next rent increase that you get. So he happened to raise it maybe another $250. So before I was paying $1,500, but by this time I was paying maybe 18 something. I can't even remember the amount. And the writing was on the wall. He was trying to push me out. It was kind of like a soft eviction. It was obvious. And so I had to move out. And I asked Kelly and I asked her sister, I said, look, like, you can keep the lease. Like, if you want, we'll move out and you can stay here. Do you want to keep doing it? And they said, Joe, we can't afford it. We can't afford to live here without you. And so at the time, my dad was having health problems, so we just moved back. We moved back with my dad. I lost track of Kelly and her sister and her family. And, you know, it was kind of sad for me because I can remember her sister's reaction one night. I could hear her through the bedroom door, and I could hear her frustration. I could hear her say, like, it's happening again, you know? And what I took to mean by that is like housing insecurity, basically. And I felt bad. I felt bad because I wanted to keep them, and I didn't know what to do. And I asked my wife, look, should we just keep trying? Should we keep paying the rent? She's like, no, we got to get out. So we got out. So that was my experience. Again, I had a place to fall back on. I ran into Kelly a few years later, and she had a place to fall back on, but it was tenuous. And when I think of rent control and just cause eviction, rent control can keep those kinds of things from happening. And so that's my story as a tenant with regards to rent control, or at least not having it here in Pasadena.
Thanks for your very powerful, insightful interview.
Sure.